Second segment sips, always there, even when you don't see them. So, you want to hear a crazy stat about Oregon's running game? In each year, subsequently, while Dan Lanning has remained the head coach in Eugene, the rushing output has gotten worse on a team-wide basis. Now, Oregon has had a 1,000-yard rusher each season. It was Bucky Irving in 2023. Pretty sure Bucky just got there in 2022. And then Jordan James this past year had just under 1,200 yards to go with 15 touchdowns. He was really good. But the overall productivity of Oregon's rushing attack can take a big step forward. Now, part of this, I do think, is due to the hire of Will Stein, who I am not going to sit here and dog on for the next 8 minutes, because I think Will Stein's really good. The list of coordinators, not just in the last 5 years, but ever in college football, that have produced back-to-back Heisman Trophy finalists at the quarterback spot, that list is incredibly small, and Will Stein has accomplished that. But what we have seen is a pullback in the rushing game, and I think that's a byproduct of Will Stein's RPO-heavy attack. When you have a lot of RPOs, you give the quarterback the ability to not hand the ball off, whereas other teams might just go with a straight handoff. That's what a team like Michigan would do, or that's what a team like Georgia Tech would do, for instance. They're not going to necessarily build in a ton of options to a play. They're just going to line up. Old school Stanford was like this as well. They're just going to line up and run the football. So Jordan James this past year ran for 1,184 yards, 5.4 yards a carry, and 15 touchdowns. Oregon's rushing yards per game from 2022 to now has gone from 216 per game in 2022 with Kenny Dillingham to 184 to 152. And this was something I touched on throughout the course of the season a couple of times, because I kept noticing, boy, they really didn't run the ball. There weren't as many games where you felt like Oregon controlled the game on the ground, or where they were as explosive on the ground. I mean, heck, Jordan James didn't have a carry of, I think it was more than 20 yards until his first or second touch in the Michigan State game. The Michigan State, that was game 5. That was the first time that Jordan James ran the ball for, it was either 15 or 20 yards. But anyway, what they categorized as an explosive. And Jason Benetti, who was the announcer on that game, who's phenomenal as a play-by-play guy, by the way, he made a point of it as he was making the run. For the first time this season, he finally breaks free. So it hasn't been a hallmark of this offense. Now you insert Makhi Hughes, who's in his 3rd year of college football, comes over from Tulane via the portal, and this past year at Tulane in the American Conference, which is this past year, I'd say probably the second best Group of 5 league in the country. So I think he's going to go against certainly a higher level of competition in the Big Ten, no doubt. I don't think it's the same sort of jump that some guys have tried to make going from the MAC to the Big Ten. But then again, Curtis Rourke did that at quarterback for Indiana, and that worked out pretty darn well. But Hughes was over 1,400 yards this year, 5.3 yards a carry to James 5.4, also ran for 15 touchdowns. Now, these two guys have some similarities. Their build is pretty similar. They're both under 6 feet tall, well-built, physical runners, but Makhi Hughes has a little bit more wiggle in his game, and I think a little bit more explosion in his game as well. So when you watch him run, if you go on YouTube, maybe as you're listening to this show, or after you listen to or watch this show, if you YouTube his highlights, you'll see plenty of explosive run plays in there. If you were to YouTube Jordan James highlights, you wouldn't see a bunch of 40, 50, 30-yard runs that were broken for long touchdowns. You know what you'd see? He runs through guys' faces. The Michigan State game, when he was dominant in the first half, he was running over defensive backs left and right and trucked a guy in the first quarter, I think it was, that made you go, "Whew, boy." He did it against Washington as well. To a guy, I'm pretty sure he did it to Ephesians Prysock. I might be remembering that player incorrectly, but got to the perimeter. Here comes a corner. You're going to lose, buddy. That's what Jordan James was. Hughes has that ability, but he also has that second gear. So I was thinking about this because I got a question from DWC Sports, and you can always submit mailbag questions, YouTube comments, Twitter, or become a Locked On Ducks insider as well. Link in the description below. You can get a free 14-day trial, priority access, and a bunch of other perks as well with regards to the mailbag. DWC Sports sent this one in saying, mailbag question, what are your expectations for the Oregon running back room this year? Does Whittington make a big jump? So, no, on Whittington. I don't expect him to. I think Noah Whittington is pretty well established at this point. I mean, he's going into, amazingly, his 4th season as a Duck. Wild to think about, right? But he came over, I believe, as a redshirt freshman in 2022, played that season, but then in 23, got cut short against Colorado due to injury. So I think he got a medical redshirt, played in 24, and now he's back for 2025. So Hughes is going to be the number one guy. That's my expectation. Whittington will have the same sort of role. I do wonder, though, if more guys get involved. You go back to that 2022 season, again, different offensive coordinator, but obviously the same head coach with Dan Lanning there. Oregon used 4 running backs regularly. They had clearly defined roles throughout the season. I think a couple guys maybe faded a bit as it went on, but we saw Buck Yerving that year. We saw Noah Whittington that year. We saw Jordan James as a short line yardage guy. And Sean Dollars was in there in certain packages as well, and as a pass catcher. So I wonder if more than 2 guys aren't involved this year. Jaden Lamar has got a season or 2. I forget which class he was a part of exactly. But, you know, he's been the number 3 back, or he was the number 3 back this past year. He's solid. I don't think he's anything special, but he's solid, capable. But what happens with Dink Riggs? What happens with Jay Harris? We only saw glimpses of those 2 guys in mop-up duty this year, but they showed me a lot more than Jaden Lamar did. But are they ready to take on a primary role in the offense? And Whittington, who, of course, has gotten hurt once before in his career, if he goes down, is it Jaden Lamar? When Jordan James went down in the Rose Bowl, it was Lamar who stepped in. But does that continue being the case? Or do they feel like they could generate more explosive plays if they incorporate more of these guys into the rushing attack? Because I think Dink Riggs, you know, famously on the Ducks versus them, you heard one of the coaches say, Little Bucky. That's what he looked like. He's just shifting through the line, making guys miss, a lot of lateral movement, going side to side, and looking really, really capable whilst doing it. You know, it wasn't like, oh boy, he needs a lot of work there. No, he looked pretty good. Again, limited action. Coaches, of course, see a lot more than you and I do. But I think the talent in this room for Rashad Samples, a running backs coach, who remains that, with Ross Douglas getting hired from Syracuse to be the wide receivers coach, of course. I think the talent there is incredibly solid. And 152 yards a game, I think they're capable of more than that. But a running back is, of course, only as good as the offensive line. Running backs seldom get away from defensive tackles. Linebackers, a little bit easier. You get a running back on a safety, offensive coordinators and head coaches actively try to get their running backs in space one-on-one with a corner or a safety. So you only get there if your offensive line plays well. Well, this past year's unit had a lot of kind of shuffling around. You know, there was the injury to Bedford preseason. Then there was the injury to Marcus Harper that came about later in the year. Like, they were trying to find the right combination early in the season. But going into next year, I don't know if the offensive line is going to be able to perform at the same level as it did this past season. But if they settle into a groove, I think you can readily make the case. As much as I love Jordan James, I really did. And if he'd come back, I'd feel similar, I would say, to how I feel right now, which is ever so slightly on the cautious optimistic side of, hey, this running attack can be better. They can get more out of it. And I think that at some level, just because Dan Lanning's a defensive guy, this is just my suspicion. Defensive guys tend to like running the ball, physicality, culture, set the tone, control the game, all that sort of stuff. I wonder if they don't have a stronger emphasis on running the ball next year. But if your offensive line isn't able to create lanes, then none of it matters. And you lost a really, really good player, of course, in Josh Connerly, and Cornelius and Harper's gone and Strother's gone. And Strother, I thought, was really good in the run game this year. So that aspect of it is slightly more challenging. But I think from a talent standpoint in the running back room, you have the tools to get more out of that area. And remember, they struggled big time in the Rose Bowl. They can be better in that area going into 2025.